first bivouac area. So I have a picture in the book that shows Austro-Hungarian soldiers preparing to attack, and they've got blankets from home around them. Without that stuff, they would have frozen to death. So they get everything they can from home because the army does not provide it, which makes it even worse. The point is that on neither side, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, or the Germans, were they ready for this? And you hear the German army is the best in the world. They couldn't fire the artillery. The Germans had been taught to fire artillery on flat land. They didn't know how to fire it in mountains. They didn't know how to fight mountain warfare. So all sides, the soldiers suffered. In fact, the last group I dedicate my book to is to those soldiers who died or survived that. This book will sell a lot in Europe when it's translated, because all these grandchildren have heard about this battle where granddad died, or if he was lucky he survived. It's never been written about before. And my argument is that the Russian, Austrian, Hungarian, German governments don't want people to know what a horrible battle this was, because it accomplished absolutely nothing, and you had over 2 million casualties. So this book in English is the first on this subject in the world, and it'll be translated into multiple languages. The roads. There were very few roads. The Polish roads had a poor macadam top. As soon as there's snow and ice, you cannot really move equipment. Horses are dying. The Hungarians bring in, and actually the Carpathian Winter War is actually a battle to keep Austria-Hungary in the war. And when people say, after they read the incorrect English versions of what happened on the Western and Eastern Front, they say, why did the Germans not launch offensives every year in the war? It's because every year they had to save the Austro-Hungarians. So this is what happened in the Carpathian Winter War, because the Austro-Hungarian and Russian army attacked each other almost the same time. Why? Because on the Carpathian Mountains, equal number of troops on the German front and of the Austro-Hungarian front, except in the mountains where it was the extreme right flank of the Austro-Hungarian armies, the extreme left flank of the Russian armies. So on the Austro-Hungarian side, you're trying to outflank the Russians, turn their flank, and you want to save this fortress, Fortress Przemysl, which was the Verdun of the East and Stalingrad of the First World War. So that was their strategy. The Russian strategy was much simpler. We have captured Przemysl in September, we lost it in October, we got it back in November. We're going to starve these people to death. They're never going to break out, and we're going to cross these mountains, no matter how many people die, and get over the mountains and invade Hungary, which would knock Austria-Hungary out of the war. This was why the Germans had to save them so often. So number one, what the book points out is it's the first major battle in mountain warfare. One of the largest amount of casualties during the whole war. And contrary to historiography, it's when the German General Staff began to take over the Austro-Hungarian General Staff, and the Austro-Hungarian government began to kowtow to the Germans. It wasn't after the Brusilov offensive, it was occurring even at this time. So it is a very significant battle. What English audience doesn't realize is the greatest victory of the Central Powers was the Battle of Gorlice Tarnov, Gorlice-Tarnov. This is when the Germans struck at the connection between the Austro-Hungarian front and their front to save the Austro-Hungarian army, drove the Russians 280 miles east. 1 million casualties on the Russian side. Now, they already had 1.4 million in the Carpathian Winter War, and 2 million prisoners of war. And again, before the Brusilov offensive, you see the army starting to fall apart. The Austro-Hungarian army had been destroyed twice before the Carpathian Winter War. In the opening campaigns, they lost 400,000 out of 1 million soldiers on the Eastern Front. They had been wiped out again between October, November, and December, fighting in the mountains. And the army would be destroyed for a third time in the Carpathian Winter War. So Austria-Hungary really, after this battle, is an appendage of the German Empire. No book has been written about this in any language. As I said, only 3 articles were ever published. They were in German, and then it all disappeared. Most of it comes from diaries, unit logbooks. When you go to do research in military history, particularly on the major wars, many of the documents at the highest command are destroyed to hide what happened. So you have to go lower. And so from these unit logs, etc., I was able to reconstruct this. But in the archives, they actually hide documents on you. I was in the Vienna War Archives one time, and they're giving me all these worthless boxes of supply documents. I'm like, oh, you know, who cares how much bread went to the 42nd Honved Regiment? Somebody had hidden the official losses, and that's where I was able to calculate the 800,000 losses. To give you an example of how terrible this battle was, the first offensive by the Austro-Hungarian army, they launched 135,000 men on a 165-mile front. Way too many troops. The offensives were actually just one line attacking, and the further they progressed, the more they spread apart. Because the Russians didn't have a lot of troops there then, and yet they had 89,000 casualties from that 130,000 troops, sent 30,000 replacement troops, which also were casualties. So if you do the figuring, they lost 80% of the attacking force. There are 3 Carpathian offensives. The second one, they bring an entire new army in, and they attack. In 2 weeks, the Second Army loses almost half of its troops. In the first week of March alone, 40,000 cases of frostbite, and only 6,000 combat losses. So it's a horrible, horrible battle. I read in the daily logs, they talk about these shadows that go flying through into no man's land on both the Russian side and the Austro-Hungarian. It happens so fast that they can't shoot whatever it is. They don't know what it is. It's a great thing for horror books, and I love horror books. But what it was wolves, Carpathian wolves. And they realize it's Carpathian wolves because within 5 or 10 minutes, the people on patrol are wounded or dying, start screaming because the wolves are eating them alive. So it's absolutely a horrendous battle. Again, this is one of the reasons why they try to hide what happened. The generals is Conrad von Hertzendorf, the chief of the general staff of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, who until I started writing about 20 years ago, when I got out of administration, was considered a great general. And so I can't see any of the family documents because I point out that he was really didn't know what he was doing. He was never a strategist. If you know the name Liddell Hart, he called one of the greatest strategists of the First War. What a joke. It never happened that way. But he came up against this wily Russian general, Ivanov, who was the commander of the Russian Southwest Front. And they both came upon the idea, let's have this campaign there. So the Russian general, he didn't care how many died. Conrad always trusted luck, never looked at the terrain, never thought of supplies and what the problem would be, and the weather broke early January, and one of the major reasons for this disastrous battle was the necessity of Russia or Austria-Hungary convincing the neutrals, Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, to come into the war, because it was believed that if any of the neutral powers came in, they would swing the balance. Well, Italy came in after Gorlitza-Tarnów, and one of the reasons Italy won the war and lost the treaty was the British and French never forgave them. They thought once the Italians came in that they would win the war, and they attacked as Gorlitza-Tarnów begins, but that's another story. I'm going to describe what the conditions were like. This comes from the book, so I'm going to be reading a good part of it. So you understand what these soldiers went through, and it's absolutely pathetic to think that, and you should be aware, many of them committed suicide to get out of this. Mountain warfare is characterized by the Carpathian Winter Offensive produced a combat experience vastly different from trench warfare on the Western Front. Heavy rainfall and blinding snowstorms left little time for troops to be able to relax or rest. Discomfort became the order of the day as the troops became susceptible to lung disease, hypothermia, exposure, and frostbite. Snow, ice, and the rugged mountain terrain made large-scale movement difficult. Considered unsuitable for large unit warfare even in the summer months, the Carpathian mountain terrain complicated all the military operations, supply efforts, and placed inhuman physical demands on the troops on both sides. The physically demanding daily routine of maintaining roads, so many horses died that combat troops had to work on the roads, reconstructing positions damaged by the